Okay, well, I think we'll begin.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Well, I'd like to welcome the Founder Circle members and all of the Mint affiliates and our other special guests who have joined us for this evening's program featuring the ceramic artist Peter Pincus. Peter has often found inspiration in historical precedents, including the work of Josiah Wedgwood. And we are so happy that Brian Gallagher, who curated the fabulous recent exhibition of Wedgwood at the Mint, has joined us tonight. And we're going to start off the program with Brian, who will give us a fuller understanding of the body of Wedgwood's work that resonated so strongly with Peter. Brian?
Thank you, Tricia. Let me just open up my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, I'm hoping people can see my first slide and can hear me okay. I just want to begin by thanking Tricia Boyer and the Founder Circle for inviting me to participate in tonight's program. And I also want to say how pleased I am to be collaborating with contemporary ceramic specialist Leslie Ferrin and ceramic artist Peter Pincus, our special guest of honor tonight, of course. I've been asked to provide a historical context for Peter's beautiful vase forms by taking a brief look at some of the ornamental vases made by another talented ceramic artist, Josiah Wedgwood. His own vase production began in earnest about 250 years ago at his so-called Etruria factory in North Staffordshire, England.
Hey, Brian, I don't want
Yes.
to interrupt you, but we cannot see your screen. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you said something. I'm looking at it. All right, let me,
We see you.
There we go.
okay. Apologies, everyone. Well, all you missed was my opening slide.
Okay, now we're good.
All right, thank you for saying that. So to begin properly, I start with this scene of Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their children in a portrait Wedgwood commissioned in 1780 from English artist George Stubbs. In the painting's lower right corner, we see Josiah sitting with his wife Sarah. Josiah is also accompanied Sorry, my mouse seems to be acting up. It was fine all day today. When did you know it? Okay. Josiah is also accompanied by one of the products from his factory. That's not so unusual, as creative individuals are often depicted in the visual arts with a representative example of their talent. But what I find striking about this portrait is that from the incredibly diverse array of ceramic wares the Wedgwood factory was producing by 1780, Josiah chose to include one of his vases in his portrait by Stubbs. The vase is made in his black basalt, a fine-grained stoneware Josiah perfected and started to produce commercially in 1768. This vase is notable in part because of its well-modeled and clever handles, which are satyr's masks whose long horns appear to pierce the vase's rim. The vase is further distinguished by exemplifying shape number 1 in the Wedgwood factory's vase shape book, an internal record of the factory's various vase forms. As we try to illustrate in the Mint's recent exhibition, Classic Black, the basalt sculpture of Wedgwood and his contemporaries, the enduring style among fashionable elites in late 18th century England was the, quote, antique taste, or neoclassicism as it is called today. As Robert Adam, James Wyatt, and other prominent architects and designers of the period were reinterpreting Greek and Roman ornament for elegant interiors, Josiah Wedgwood and his Staffordshire peers were producing classically inspired wares to furnish the same types of spaces. The most ubiquitous and varied form they offered was the vase, and their vase production was in direct response to the rapidly growing demand among style-conscious, affluent English consumers. Wedgwood was certainly aware of this burgeoning wave, writing to his business partner and close friend, Thomas Bentley, in January 1769 that, quote, An epidemical madness reigns for vases, which must be gratified. On May 1st, 1769, Wedgwood wrote again to Bentley, saying that, quote, Mrs. Byerley, that's Wedgwood's sister, is just returned from London and brings a strange account of their goings on in Newport Street. She says vases was all the cry. During Josiah's lifetime, he died in 1795, his factory produced more than 250 vase shapes to satisfy the demand from his customers. After the antique was the phrase he and Bentley used to describe their vases and other ornaments on the title page of their first trade catalog, published in 1773, as well as in all subsequent catalogs published during their partnership. As evidenced by the examples here, that was obviously a fluid concept for them, as their vases were just as likely to be based on considerably more recent designs. The fanciful tripod vase on the left, for instance, derives from a design by 18th century French artist Joseph Marie Vienne and published by his wife Marie-Thérèse Reboul in 1760. The pair of vases in the middle are based on a design by Friedrich Kirchner, an 18th century German engraver and painter of miniatures. The source for Wedgwood's vase on the right, specifically for its lion's head handles, was an illustration in 17th century French designer Jacques Stella's Livre de Vases, published in 1667. Of course, Wedgwood did sometimes copy from an antique prototype, particularly from the ancient vase collection owned by his patron, Sir William Hamilton, and published in 4 volumes in 1766, 1767 by Baron Pierre d'Anquetil. This large crater vase, made about 1790 at Etruria, is a faithful replica of an antique form illustrated in volume 1 of d'Anquetil's publication of Hamilton's collection. So far, I've been talking exclusively about Wedgwood's vase production in his black basalt. He did, of course, produce vases in other ceramic bodies, cream-colored earthenware, white stoneware, and others, but arguably it was his jasperware that ultimately became the most highly admired in Josiah's own lifetime and remains the ceramic body most associated with him today. He introduced it commercially in 1775. The Mintz collection, unfortunately, does not include strong examples of jasperware vases, and so I'm showing you this cream bowl to illustrate the most common jasperware color combination, which is blue with white reliefs. But Wedgwood's jasperware came in many other colors and patterns too. I end by showing this image of the Wedgwood showrooms as they appeared in 1809 to point out that we obviously discussed only a handful of Josiah's wares and his myriad innovations tonight. His contributions to the field of ceramics is virtually inestimable, and I think that a fitting testament to his legacy is that supremely talented modern-day ceramic artists like Peter Pincus are still finding inspiration in Josiah's body of work and using that inspiration to create amazing new marvels for us to admire and enjoy. Thank you. And let me now stop sharing my screen. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Leslie Ferrin.
So, are we here? Okay, hi. I'm in my virtual room, which is the gallery, and it's my pleasure to have been invited to talk with all of you today with the Founders Circle, Del Home Society, and some other guests. So I wanted to introduce Peter. He's a true New Yorker, born in Rochester. He attended Alfred University, receiving his BFA in 2005 and MFA in 2011. Since 2014, Peter has been an associate professor of art at the School for American Crafts at Rochester Institute of Technology. Widely known as both a brilliant artist and an adept technician, he has mastered online teaching while continuing to balance family and work as a studio artist. Despite the challenges of this complicated year, in July, he also completed a new series of work for his exhibition at our gallery, Ferrin Contemporary. Peter is known for his ceramics practice driven by inquiry that blends color theory, the history of decorative arts, and cutting-edge technical experimentation. His research-based practice has helped shape his 2 solo exhibitions at Ferrin Contemporary, the first channeling Josiah Wedgwood in 2018, which followed 2 funded research trips to work with Ann Forschler and the Wedgwood collection at the Birmingham Museum of Art in Alabama. His most recent show was based on examination of several conceptual works by Sol LeWitt that led to the work he produced for the Age of Influence, Peter Pincus, Sol LeWitt. Peter's work can be found in numerous private and public collections, including the Down Museum of Contemporary Art in Sedalia, Missouri, the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York, Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, Texas, ASU, Ceramics Research Center, Alfred University, and the Gardner Museum in Toronto. I turn the spotlight now to Peter Pincus from his studio live in Rochester.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Let me pull up my screen. How's everyone doing tonight? I am, as Leslie said, Peter Pincus. I thank you, Leslie, for introducing me. That was the words very kind. It's an honor to have you introduce me. I also thank everyone that is involved with the Mint. I thank Sarah, I thank Trisha, I thank Brian, and I thank every one of you as part of the Founders Circle for joining us this evening. It is a dream to be able to work with museums, to be able to think about history and think about ceramics, and that is only possible because of your support. So I'm very, very thankful for the opportunity to share what I do here in Rochester with you. So this is the Founders Hour with me. It was very hard to write Peter Pincus in third person, but this is what is happening tonight. In a very quick, brief window, we are going to do an introduction, what, a why, and a how, as well as hopefully a studio stroll. So we have a lot to get through, and I will do my best to move quickly. I will begin with an introduction. As you've heard, I am Rochester, New York based, and there is 2 ways to experience Rochester. You can go online and check it out, and you will see brilliant images of a colorful city. It's very beautiful here from these pictures if you go online, or if you actually look from my perspective, it looks a little bit more like this today. Rochester is a weather city, only overshadowed by a few, but I swear, I promise to all of you that in a few months, it's going to be vibrant and amazing and full of Japanese maples. And so I welcome you. I know that these are very, very strange times. And I hope that when it's over, if you're ever in Rochester, you can come pay me a visit, and hopefully it might look a little bit more like this. My name is, of course, Peter Pincus, and I come to you as one half of this studio. My wife and partner, Lori Pincus, is not here right now. We work in the studio together. She has assisted me and works on a great deal, if not all of the current projects that we have going on. And just upstairs are our 2 children, Evelyn and Britton Pincus, who are now 8 and 6 and loving that online learning. And we all function and work here in Rochester, and our studio is just beyond their reach and at their door. So our home is open to you. And if you ever come to our home in that studio, you will see work that's produced in it that looks a whole lot like this. So as you know, probably by now, I make ceramics. I specifically make vessels. You may not know that I'm an educator. I teach at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is this kind of amazingly diverse technology-based school that has a very large, robust art and design program. And in it, there is a very intimate ceramics department, which is known as the School for American Crafts historically. And this is a place where students tend to focus on sculpture and vessels that has a relationship to history. They're very interested in thinking about those sorts of connections between what they produce and what has come before. And my role there is to, of course, work with the majors and then also to introduce new people to plaster. I have this sort of dream that everyone can fall in love with plaster in the way that I have. And so I teach it experimentally at the Rochester Institute of Technology with students from both in the major and students from all over the school and college, including engineers and architects and mathematicians and scientists. And I teach alongside this individual, Jane Schellenbarger, whom many of you might know. If you do not know Jane, I think of her as one of the great living potters, and in my mind, a scholar of ceramic history. And so we sort of both occupy very different realms of the vessel world. And it's no surprise to me that that I would sort of follow suit, and that Jane and I together are forming a program which has quite a bit of interest in thinking about this relationship of working with history as a 21st century studio practitioner. Now, Leslie told you I have been working towards some exhibitions, and a recent example is a show about influence. And this was put up just last year during the height of COVID, and more specifically, it was Art in the Age of Influence, Peter Pincus and Sol LeWitt. And I've been looking at the Mass MoCA collection, the Sol LeWitt retrospective. So a series of wall drawings, very, very large wall drawings, and sort of thinking a little bit about how ideas influence ideas, how history sort of influences the production of new artwork. And this has been not only a project that I've been working on, but more specifically sort of a series of intimate conversations with Leslie Ferrin about, you know, how we sort of work with precedents. And so one of the, or perhaps the only object from this project that I will highlight is wall drawing 422, which was my response to a prompt by Leslie. She asked me, how could you, or could you think about maybe replicating something that has come almost verbatim? So take the sort of concept of Sol LeWitt's wall drawing 422, which is to divide the wall into 15 vertical sections, paint the first 4 gray, yellow, red, blue, and then all 2, 3, and 4 part iterations therein. And that sort of raises this really difficult question about when something is a collaboration and when something is plagiarism. And so this was a long-standing project in which I actually tried my hardest to sort of replicate the work that I saw in the Sol LeWitt on the wall drawing and by the rules of Sol LeWitt. But it was very, very uncomfortable to sort of go through with replicating something verbatim. And so on the other side of this work, I built 15 columns where I sort of lost that drawing in a very, very highly contrasting color field. And so we see this sort of stepping forward and stepping backwards of 15 panels. And also this sort of movement outward where there's this sort of puzzle piece of interlocking sections. And so there's a lot going on in this piece. And it's my hope is that it is both something that is kind of starting to think about the premise of how Sol LeWitt worked, and also sort of playfully exploring the space around it and how it might relate to contemporary ceramics. And that's kind of a weird thing for me to say. The idea that I'm working as a 38-year-old working with historic precedents is very, very unusual to me, because I wasn't a particularly good student growing up, and I don't necessarily think of myself as an academic. And so this presentation has given me a chance to sort of think about where all of this came from. And I've had some really fairly profound mentors in my life, one being Linda Sikora here, someone who found me when I was 18 and has been a mentor to me ever since, both through undergrad and grad. And she sort of taught me, or started to put this thing in my head about the significance of not only understanding the pot as an object and as a cultural sort of thing, but then also understanding how that relates to a complete history and is part of a more broad conversation. And by the time I left Linda Sikora for the first or the second time, I started to have these interests in thinking about specifically European manufactured objects. Now, I can't say again that there was nothing truly academic. I saw the work. I was sort of mesmerized by something technical in the work and by something aesthetic in the work. And it wasn't the only thing that I was focused on. I was also sort of starting to think about pop culture, starting to think about how color was being used in pop culture. And then I was also starting to think a little bit about color theory. And all of this together creates kind of a mess of work. In 2011, when I left my education with Linda and with the other teachers at Alfred University, I was making work that was sort of a conglomeration of those ideas of something that has to do with historic ceramics, something that has to do with color theory, and something that has to do with sort of communicating between the field of ceramics and the field of culture, the sort of the larger cultural picture. And this was in 2011, and by about 2014, late 2014, everything started to sort of come together, where I saw the pot as this sort of image of an object and something that was subject to thinking about relationships, thinking about application of color as it related to surface and space. And it was right about that time, just shortly thereafter, this image that I was introduced to Leslie Ferrin, and Leslie invited me to participate in an exhibition. And I would say that she was the sort of second driving force in this sort of conversation around initiation. So I went to her gallery space, and it is on the Mass MoCA campus. And that would be the first time I would sort of see Sol LeWitt. And so I would see these sort of real life applications of people who themselves were sort of thinking through similar things about color theory and transparency, albeit sort of through their own aesthetic lens and through their own conceptual lens. And that kind of set things in motion, this really sort of exciting push forward that between 2015 and say 2017, 18, I was sort of really interested in starting to understand how color worked, how one might be able to use color very effectively to start to create differences in pictorial space, i.e. transparency and whatnot. And the work went as far as to really start to engage with these ideas of transparency, as you see in this trio here on the left, which still to date might be the most laborious and meticulous thing that has come out of 44 Devonshire Drive. It was about 2016 that Leslie sent me this really cool email that just said, hey, great patterned work from mid-century 20th. And I really had no idea what she was talking about, but I sort of took a click and started to look at this, this work. And Leslie said, well, hey, what would you think about going to a museum and sort of checking some of this work out and seeing it for yourself? And that idea was completely foreign to me. I didn't really know how one would gain access. I didn't know how I could even afford to do it. And she very generously found some funding. She introduced me to the third of the gatekeepers, if you will, Anne Forschler, whom I believe to be one of the most brilliant individuals in the field of ceramics, who has sort of been a guiding force and always been very open to any questions I may have about history and specifically Wedgwood. And so Anne says, sure, you could come to Birmingham. And she sends me a few catalogs and says, flip through these catalogs. And yeah, and anything you want to see, you can just take a look. And I flew down and I was hooked. And so it's been a very strange sort of development of me starting to think of myself as an artist who works with history, as very much not an art historian, clearly. We are here not to hear as much about the introductions as to think about Birmingham, Alabama, which sort of ties my work to some of the things that have happened at the Mint Museum. I went to the Birmingham in 2017. It was really beautiful out there, and the trees didn't have any leaves, but it was quite warm. And I went there to hypothetically study this mid-20th century Wedgwood, which is this sort of world of difference from what I actually found when I walked into the room and started sort of handling this historic work from the 18th, late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I particularly recall being enamored by these two encaustic pots, these sort of Etruscan pots by Wedgwood that I couldn't even imagine seeing objects of this sort of level of beauty, this sort of level of refinement, and this sort of aesthetic purpose. It was just like, it was very hard for me to understand that this was something that came out of anyone's hands, let alone a manufacturer's hands who is producing these at sort of great volume, or relatively great volume. And so there was this sort of shock factor of seeing objects like this firsthand and holding them, and then also being able to start to look at the mechanics of these objects and understand how they're put together, how they're taken apart. And I really had no idea what I was going to do with this. I flew home, it was March. I talked to Leslie on the phone. I was like, I don't know, that was a really great experience, but what to do? So the first thing I did was I put together a few slide shows. First, our Wedgwood moment, ceramics, technology, and culture in the 21st century. And then second, channeling Josiah Wedgwood, where I asked myself, what would Josiah do? And I sort of put the work in the context of people who in the 21st century are replicating or 3D printing or scanning Wedgwood's work. And I also then tried to kind of move back and forth between that context and what it meant to be working in the 18th century, what it meant to have that sort of technology, and what innovation meant at that point. And so it would be back and forth between the 18th century and things like Andy Brayman's vase that is its own cell phone that has reception and you can contact someone from anywhere around the world. And then thinking a little more overarchingly about Katie Parker and Guy Michael Davis and individuals who work with museums and who work with collections and think about repurposing and or reimagining collections in the 21st century. And at some point this started to form into an exhibition, although it was very much just a beginning. It was the first show, channeling Josiah Wedgwood, in 2018 with Leslie. And so I was starting to think a little bit about the Calyx crater and starting to think a little bit about the blue and white and trying to put a few things together, but it was still at that point incredibly foggy to me. And if anything, well, two things, Leslie, we have to have another because I'm so much more excited now, right? We're on it. But number two, it sort of brought out this concept of imitation, which is quite different from influence, right? Influence being a conceptually based thing, imitation is an object-based thing. And if I return to these two Etruscan pots that I held at Birmingham, I left and I really couldn't let them go. There was something about the lip, something about the way this lip kicked back. There was something about all these ridges and the complexity, the specificity of this handle and this foot that I just sort of couldn't let go. And I found myself living through the images I took at Birmingham and trying to study particular nuances of that form. A few months later, I would be in Chicago and I would see this Hydra, this 4th century Hydra, at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I would sort of flip out my phone and recognize that there was this sort of parallel between these two lips that I just couldn't put myself in the position of someone in the 18th century sort of replicating or imitating something that had preceded them so much. And also, doing so when it was before the age of Instagram. How crazy is that? And then I would sort of think about other objects that were made at the same period, or also objects that were made in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and sort of flip through the images that I had and start to note these very particular nuances of form that I found that, and I could be wrong because I'm not an art historian, but I found that those sort of subtleties of form really did not occur in work of the contemporaries, of work of the other people. There was just such a sophistication of the way that he dealt with the lip, the foot, the handle, and whatnot. And so I would think about this jasperware, which is obviously the crowning achievement, and the color in that is something that is subject to an entirely different lecture. But I would put that next to this beautiful Meissen vase at the Birmingham, and I would really think long and hard about what separates this sort of fundamentally changed in terms of the different manufacturers' interest in how to sort of see or visualize form. And so lucky for me, I was invited back. I did not overstay my welcome, and Anne said, please return. And so we had a second trip together, and this trip was very, very, very different from the first, because the first I didn't really have a sense of what I wanted. I just was sort of in it for the ride. But before the second trip, I had time to learn much more about Josiah, learn about Bentley, and start to understand the context of their times, which I think is crucial to understanding the context of their work. And the great discovery, the great find, was this amazing Antiquities from the Cabinet of the Humble William Hamilton, the Sir William Hamilton. This book, which exists at the Birmingham in real form and of course as a copy. And so we were able to, Anne and I and the group, sort of look through the book and find examples, blueprints, structural examples of these vases, and sort of pair them against the real thing, the thing that Wedgwood would make. And so it started to paint this picture for me of someone who really had invested in drawing and really had invested in understanding history in a way that I wasn't sure if other people had access to or not, or if they just weren't as meticulous in their interpretation of that history. And so I would pick up a form that I would find to be very captivating by Wedgwood, and then look at it against to the drawing of it, and then sort of play this little game where I would find these little subtle nuances of things that he would keep, things that he would leave, the areas that he would stylize. And so this is helping me gain a more complete picture of how someone sort of builds form from a historic precedent. And the Calyx crater, which I had studied initially in the first round of the Wedgwood channeling Josiah Wedgwood, I would then sort of find it in the book, and I would have all the numbers, and I would be able to take it into the studio and replicate it. And then I would bring images along with that picture and start to look at those and think about, again, what he kept, what he left. And I still don't really understand why or where he made certain choices to change proportions, to change shape, to change lip, and to change foot. And I suppose maybe that's a conversation for round 3 at Birmingham, but that would at least start to sort of inform my picture of what sort of differentiated Josiah from his from the others that were working in around the same time, and even today. Now, I say all of this from the perspective of someone who invests very heavily in studio practice, not necessarily scholarship by reading and research. So to me, these sort of drawings and the objects that they sort of might speak to don't really gain any sort of profound significance to me until I bring them into the studio. And so they will always have this interaction with material. And for me, that material is plaster. It is something that I need to touch every day in order to feel fulfilled in life. And it's something that brings its own sort of structural, architectural, and material qualities that inform the nature of an object. And so work that I make will always be a byproduct of those things that I'm learning from history, and then also those things that I'm learning from material and from technology. If you could call plaster technology, it is, just not necessarily new technology. And so to be a little bit more specific about that, I want to walk through this pair of scratch spin amphora, amphorae, which are actually 2 objects which were a part of the Art in the Age of Influence exhibition, Sol LeWitt and Peter Pincus, although they are not necessarily directly related to any Sol LeWitt objects themselves. They're actually related to an object that looks a whole lot like this, not exactly this one, but I found it in my pictures from the second trip of Birmingham, and a boot that looks like this, a snowboarding boot, the Black Sabbath boot from 2011, which was the very first pop culture object that I tried to place on the skin of a pot. These are 2 cups from 2011. And so I want to kind of give you a sense of, I had this object and I had this surface, and I was really interested in building a relationship between the 2. And so I always begin with some sort of drawing apparatus. So I will have, paper, and I will start to sketch out proportions and find ideas. And this might be with Calyx craters, where I am quite literally sort of taking those blueprinted proportions from the collection the Hamilton collection, and then messing with them a little bit, like changing them, altering them, which if we have time, we could do some of that tonight. But then from there, you know, I have to build this thing. And so I have to face the realities of the material and the realities of the process, which really didn't relate to the workings or the inner workings of object making in the 18th century. So working with this modular molding system involves having to throw things in sections and build things in sections. So this is a cutout that you see here. And I had to sort of find a way to join these together to create a shape that would be seamless. And so for me, that meant throwing two sections, they're connected right here, and then building out an exterior and an interior shell. So basically building a mold around a mold. And this you see, this was cast, and then I shaped this and I started drawing on the surface of this. And in that drawing, in that shaping, I'm starting to discover, and the form is starting to take its own avenues, its own perspectives, whatnot. And so that byproduct of that mold is sitting right here on the table in the form of a series of slivers of a shape, which have a quatrefoil pattern cut out from them. And so when I build a mold around a mold like this, I am able to cast sections and interlock things in ways that aren't necessarily possible when you're just looking at throwing on the wheel or hand building. And so here's another image of those sections that are starting to come together. And it's my job here to start to find a way to pull them together long enough to hold them together and form plates that connect things. And this is another section or an image of 4 pieces which are sitting together on a table, and then 4 pieces which are sort of put together. And so we have to hold it all long enough that I can band it from top and bottom so that I can make a formal mold out of it. And then when I have a mold, and everyone's very, very interested in this part of the process, I start to lay a colored veneer surface on top of it. So you can see here, this is gray, this is porcelain, and then there's black and there's white and there's gray again and black and white. And so piece by piece, I lay down a colored slip, which is a wet clay that dries very quickly on the plaster. And then I cut it by knife and remove it and add the next piece and remove it and add the next piece. When I'm done, I put the mold together, I pour clay into it. That clay sort of sucks the veneer onto it, and then pull that mold off, and I have a veneer, which you see here. And then I have a gray interior. So all of the color that you see in the composition is done in the wet clay form so that I'm not really dealing with any glaze whatsoever. And in forms like this, they're very, very particular. So this big bulbous shape with this very tiny leg here really doesn't have any chance of surviving a kiln firing. So this bottom section and this top section are fired separately. This one is placed in a holder, a temporary holder, which is broken after the mature firing. And after bisque, each piece is sanded for this probably 5 or 6 hours to remove any imperfections, or as many imperfections as I can possibly remove. And then in the end, I have to balance them together precariously and glue the top to the bottom. And so what am I trying to get across when I'm sharing this with you? Well, number one, you can't come into the studio and we can't really do a demonstration today. So I thought in my own way, I would give you a little bit of a walkthrough of what it is like to kind of see the evolution of a particular piece of work through some of its many stages. And then also to give you a sense of the kind of the melding together of an interest in a historic form, and then how that thing sort of develops as a byproduct of manipulation in the studio process. Now, of course, it's a little over the top, and I don't think that you're going to understand the complete picture. But if you were ever really interested in understanding more about the work and how it is produced, I would be very open to sharing it with you, either individually or collectively at a time that would be more appropriate. And this also gives you a sense of how objects like this, that have sort of, I don't know how they're perceived from the outside, but from the inside, they have a very elaborate story, each of which is the development of perhaps a half a year's work and research into how plaster works. And so there's as much this sort of interest in an object and interest in a complex modular system that takes learning and development and growth. And so I think what would Leslie say about me at this point, that I'm meticulous might be one word, a little uptight or over the top. And so it's really, really good that the objects that I produce have this life that extends beyond me, where they're able to find new homes. They go out in the world and I lose some of the control I have over them. And they in turn find themselves in these really beautiful houses and communities of other objects, which is sort of the greatest part of pottery, isn't it? This sort of movement, this changing of the intention of the object as it trades hands and goes into different spaces. Now, I rushed through all of that. That is a very brief introduction of me and what I do. I want to give you as well a brief studio tour, virtual, of course, and then sort of open it up to any questions, or if you want to see anything, we can jump around and look in the studio or look at some lectures I might have prepared. So quickly, so rude of me to not bring you through my home. Here we are, we're back at this slide. And there's Evie, of course. So they were standing on the other side of that wall. And when you walk in, we've built our studio into our home. So that we call this the color room. This is the place where we are adding that colored veneer to the surface. So this is where Lori works. So Lori and I work together. I work on this side of the table and she works on that side. She layers color and I cut, and the plaster pieces move back around. And I'm just noticing now that I'm telling you this and showing you this video that there's nothing but white walls in the color room. That seems to be a little bit crazy. Anyhow, we have that small space upstairs, and then the majority of our studio, about 1,300 square feet, is downstairs. This is Mission Control, which COVID, right, folks? It has turned into my healthy station where I ride my bike every day to keep myself fit and from going crazy. But generally, this is the place where clay would be mixed with color, and where everything would kind of come into the studio and go from the studio. So boxes would be packed and brought in. Once pieces have been made with veneers, they're brought down to the casting space. So the casting space is where all of our liquid clay is held and poured. So we see here on the back wall, we see boxes and we see full bins of colored slip. We have about 40 big and small bins of colored slip that we use. And then on this side, we have a very large tub of colored porcelain slip that's used to fill large molds, and then smaller mixtures of slip as well, and a spattering of molds everywhere. And then hidden, of course, is storage. Just ignore that. But pay attention to this. This is where I am right now, the real desk for the virtual classroom. It's amazing how life has changed. And Leslie sort of alluded to the concept that I have become comfortable with teaching, and that's a generous statement of her to make. I've been teaching it virtually for a year now. And so my life is here, and I'm not going to show it to you, but there's tables around here, there's cameras, there's equipment, and there's lights all around here. So this is where I live every day. It's kind of wild. And then the plaster lab. So this is where exclusively where plaster is made, where all the research is done and tools are used. So you can see it from here. This whole long space used to be the plaster lab before virtual teaching. And then this here, the technology hub. Lori loves my use of words like technology. Kilns, wheels, saws, that's about as advanced as technology gets here in this studio. So everything is thrown on the wheel initially, plaster is poured around it. Immediately, and then that plaster is manipulated and modified. And the gallery, which is looking a little bit bare, and my kilns, everything is fired in these two kilns. So when you see larger work that's produced, it's usually made in one of these kilns and then glued together. And then hidden is the bunker. And folks, that is a very brief studio tour. I say goodnight, but I leave us with some time where we can talk, where we can sort of dig into some of the ideas I presented, and I can answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, Peter, thank you so much for that. Everybody, if you have any questions, down at the bottom of the screen, you can use your reactions to raise your hand. And if you have a question, just raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and hopefully we can get to everyone who has a question for Peter. Anyone? Y'all don't be shy. Okay, Leslie has a question.
I figure I'm the one for the dead space questions here.
Yeah.
So Peter, what are you working on next? I saw some crazy things on your Instagram that had some bowls, some really wide forms.
Yeah, so I could jump in. What I'm working on next, actually, right now, we all have experienced something relatively traumatic, and that is sort of changing the way that we operate. In my studio, as I've said, I haven't been as productive as I used to be. I used to spend 50 to 60 hours a week in this studio, every week without fail, working on those objects. I haven't really made anything in ceramics for a period of 3 months now, which is the strangest feeling I've ever had. And in place of that, I'm working on a video series, a very elaborate video series that I believe it's a sort of an experimental approach to mold making that could help anyone, regardless of their understanding of three-dimensional artwork, of material or anything, to learn how to make competent molds in about 6 to 7 weeks. And so it's been this sort of extreme labor of love, which has involved all of these interactive, what I'm calling live action lectures, as well as interactive tests, which sort of collect the experience of mold making. And so it's become this real teaching thing where I'm spending a great deal of time really thinking about how to articulate these complex ideas of geometry and architecture and structure in very simple ways that hopefully will have the benefit of helping people start to not hate plaster when they work with it. So it's a completely asynchronous program that I'm testing right now at RIT alongside students. So giving them the videos and then watching and seeing how they produce work from them. But that being said, Leslie, there's a time for everything. And the time for me to sit in here and not work on ceramics it's drawing to a close, because my life has purpose when I'm working. I've done it since I was 16, and I have never spent a week or two not working in ceramics until COVID. And during COVID, I've spent more time than I wish to share not working in ceramics. And so I have some molds that I've produced for you, actually, and that I didn't really get a chance to finish those molds. There's a series of work that are based on some Sol LeWitt paintings that are objects and trios and closed forms and lidded jars, and they're sort of bringing in 3D printed components and thinking about simple and complex geometry. So they're sitting there, and I say to Lori every week, Friday's our day, we're gonna start. So those are in the works. There are also some low sort of double-walled bowls. Right before COVID hit, there was a series of very low objects that were also sort of in the Wedgwood language that didn't quite make it through, and I didn't have a chance to get back to them. So there's a lot of that stuff that's kind of just waiting for me to return. Oh, I see some hands.
Yeah, we got some. Trisha, you were next in line. Would you like to unmute yourself? And
Okay, so forgive me for getting back into the weeds, but I really like to understand process and technique, and yours is so complicated. But am I kind of getting it to imagine that everything starts with a shape that's thrown on the wheel, and then you construct a mold around the shape, a plaster mold? Wet plaster is molded. You don't carve the plaster ever. Do you carve the plaster sometimes?
Yes. Can I show you something?
Okay.
I taught a workshop in January where I made an object and then I spelled it out in a PowerPoint. So I will pull that up and I will show you, and it should sort of clarify. I'm getting there. Hold on. I apologize for the delay. I should have thought of this. Okay. Thank you for your patience. I should be faster. I don't want to waste your time.
We have so many other things to do.
So we were talking in this workshop about the basics. And so we were looking at a cup. So imagine this as being a cup that you would find in your kitchen, right? That cup is thrown as a model upside down. This would be the wheel, and this would be the clay form. Plaster is immediately poured around it. And then that forms a mold, right? That's the simplest concept. You move the clay out of it, and that void where the clay was forms your mold. So then that mold is used to create multiples. And in my case, I did a little, obviously that then is used to add color. But if we look at simple molding systems like this, these are a series of 4-part molding systems that have a lot of surface and color work. You have the model. This is a top view. So you have a model, and you have your plaster mold, which is poured around it. The model is made of clay. The mold is plaster. The simplest way that I would go about dissecting this object is to draw a bullseye and to extend that bullseye out an inch in any direction, or ½ inch in any direction. So I essentially have a void, which is 1 inch that has been removed from the center of this object. And then when I put those mold parts together, they form that sort of relationship between the radius of the cup and then also the mitered edge. And so this is an example of this in a cup form. So you see here, it's both round and squared. And then things become more complex. So here is just build a cutting more. And so this is a series of 12 pieces, which now you have some modularity. You can move them around, you can push them in, and that creates a form, or you can pleat them, and that creates a form. And so there's all of these options with modularity when you just have simple geometry that's, you know, exposed to the multiple. So then all you need are base plates to hold this in place, and that's a different conversation. These are base plates here. So this is an example of modularity, right? This is the same bowl that has been splayed in 3 different directions and sort of frozen by base plates that hold it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And then the color is, you said it's all in wet clay. So once you get the pieces of the mold arranged the way you want them, then you adhere the wet clay that's colored with what, oxides?
Yeah, so it's colored with mason stain, which mason stain is actually used for pools and concrete. Isn't that pretty cool? And ceramics. And so mason stain is just a pigment that's put into clay, and it turns the clay into a sort of a paint. So you have paint chip color, very predictable color. You put it in between 5 and 10% of the total composition percentage. and you have a red or a blue or a yellow, and then you can mix those together to get yourself secondary, tertiary, and so forth.
Okay, so then those are adhered to the sides of the mold, and then you pour in the wet slip?
Correct.
Which just happens to adhere perfectly to the more, the less viscous colored clay?
Yeah, so the clay that is used to produce this, it's casting slip. It's been deflocculated. So there has been, a chemical has been put into it, which changes the electrostatic relationship between particles so that they repel one another, but so it looks like they're liquid when they're actually not necessarily a liquid in the traditional sense. They're not full of water. And so that repelling makes them appear to look like a liquid, but they become incredibly sticky. So that clay that has dried somewhat to almost a leather hard state, like a pre-leather hard state on the surface of the plaster, immediately forms a bond with that sticky slip on the outside of it. And then the plaster keeps absorbing through the veneer into the base slip that holds it. And why does this happen? Science, I hope.
Well, now I'm thinking
you're
going to get to the part where the physics students from RIT are coming over to your classes too. So that's.
I have two chemists in one of my classes right now. And these videos, to the best of my ability, I've researched the language, and I'm very careful with the language, and I know it's wrong because they're chemists and I'm not, so I constantly ask for feedback, like, to help me understand this.
So Peter, we had a couple of questions in the chat that kind of correlate to what you were just saying. Lauren was wondering, does the form come before color, or does the color drive the form? And then someone else was wondering, Mackenzie was wondering about the type of plaster that you use.
I use #1 pottery plaster. And if you would like, Mackenzie?
Yeah, Mackenzie McDonald.
Hi, Mackenzie. If you would like, I could send you a little video on plaster that talks about how I mix it, the different ways to measure and mix.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. I'll type my email in.
Cool. Or just send a note after this, because I might, if I miss the email chat, that'd be so sad.
Okay, thank you.
And then, like I said, Lauren was wondering about the color before form, or form before color. I think I have that right.
In the planning and conception of the work, or in the actual production of the work? That's a good question. The form and the color sort of come together because molds are negative spaces. They're hollows. They exist to contain the object, which doesn't exist until you pour the slip into it. So by extension, the colored veneer is produced before the shape is ever made, and the shape then conforms to the colored veneer. That's a pretty conceptual way to think about that, but I've never done that before, but that's cool. But in the sort of, in the initial iterating ideas, that is like a kind of a half and half sort of thing, right? Sometimes I'm thinking very specifically about how color works, and I want to pair that with an object. And so in the drawing stages, I'm really careful to hopefully not overdo or over construct the object that color would need to stand on. And then sometimes it works vice versa. Something I would like to see in 2021, is that what year it is? I would like to see a relationship between the colors that I've been making and decals. And so that's something else, Leslie, that we haven't talked about, but so I've been doing a little bit of baseline research into transparent color decals that might find ways to sort of overlay, and that would be a color first and then object second consideration.
Awesome, thank you. And we had, I think Gary has been waiting very patiently with his question. Are you ready, Gary?
Yes, Peter, thank you so much. I've appreciated, I'm sure others have as well, your ceramics from a contemporary perspective, and never understood the historical perspective you had, especially in terms of form, when you talk about Wedgwood and the Greeks and that. But what is so unique, anyway, thanks for sharing that with us. But what is so unique, I think, in your work is then you then add really contemporary colors to it. And can you talk a little bit more? I'm sort of building on Lauren's question. Talk a little bit more about adding the colors that you do to those historic, if you will, forms.
Yeah, so the color comes about in a few ways. There's obviously limitations to the type of color that I put on a form. So even before I make any decisions, the decisions are made for me to some extent. Ceramics plus pigment only builds out so wide a color profile. And you can do a lot within it, but you can only do so much within it. And I choose to do the most loud thing I possibly can do with the colors that I have available. That's sort of an extension of my personality, I suppose, and an extension of what I think is interesting. And early on when I started it, an extension of what I thought might be interesting to contribute to the field at the time when I was starting to sort of establish myself within the conversation a little bit. Now, more specifically, the color, as I said, comes from this interest in Albers. I had to teach a two-dimensional design course when I graduated from college with my MFA, and I didn't know how to do that. And so I rested on this book, The Interaction of Color, which I had, when I was a freshman, it was taught to me. And I had this sort of miserable experience where I didn't understand it, and I didn't understand how to interact with students, and I was just really kind of poor at the job. And so I spent a lot of time with that book trying to truly understand it so that I could teach my students. And the only way that I could understand it in about 2011 was to mimic what I saw in the book. So start to apply it to ceramics. And there was a large period of time where what you saw in those books was playing out almost identically in the work that I was producing. And then that also met a lot of a very shallow interest I had in what was happening in sort of fashion and pop culture at the time. Not shallow in that I had poor intentions, but I just wasn't really, I'm not a very fashionable individual, right? Not looking dapper, but I did have this interest in thinking about how there was this world outside of the clay world. I was so sort of interested in what was happening in the ceramics community, and I knew very little about what was happening outside of it. And so the first thing that I sort of held on to was this idea that the way that people dressed had something to do with their personalities and the perception of them. And so I kind of got into that, and I tried to bring that together with what I was sort of experiencing in Albers, and it kind of exploded out into the work that you see here. And then over time that has both solidified to some extent and then also gone away. And so sometimes I just want to be a little bit more fluid. In 2015, my wife Lori left her job in development and started working in the studio as an assistant. And so from 2015 till now, obviously there's been a ton of growth. And I think of her much more as a partner in this thing. She's obviously not here speaking right now. She's uncomfortable with speaking, or even with people thinking that she's a partner in this, but I think she's a partner. And the piece that's sitting behind Leslie was as much a conversation between the two of us as something that I had initially dreamt up, right? It would never come to be without us working together. So there's a part of this color interaction thing that is this sort of conversation, this way that Lori and I are getting to know each other differently, and this thing that we're building together. And so that's sort of taking on its own life, and new color arrangements and ideas are coming out of that all the time.
Very cool. Thank you.
All right, Anne, you have waited so patiently down there in Birmingham.
Thank you. It's actually Jürgen has a question.
Here's Jürgen Tarasch. I'm Anne's husband from Birmingham, Alabama. I have a question for Peter. Thank you very much. I really enjoy your talk. I have a question regarding your studio. Do you need to keep a certain constant temperature for all your work? The cast, but also maybe for the molds. And did you have any surprises or situations where your molds were destroyed by moisture and frost because you are living in a different zone, and that, you know, that sometimes you are surprised how weather can affect your work.
Well, this basement stays fairly consistent. The most important thing is a dehumidifier. If anyone is ever thinking about a basement studio, I could talk for hours on that. I have a few lectures to sort of steer you in the right direction, because a big part of what I've been able to do here is build whatever I want, because I wasn't paying rent for the studio space when it mattered the most. So I'm a huge proponent of having a space, especially now that I have kids too. I can run down here. They're upstairs right now while I'm down here. It's a pretty good deal, but it does come at the expense of some of the things that you're saying, like depending on what the way you work and what you work with, it's very important to have a moderated studio. So we have a little bit of heat in here. When we did our second renovation, we added some heat runs down here, so it keeps it kind of warm, not very warm, but that's nice because I have my bike down here. So when I'm riding, I like it a little cool. What's more important for plaster, which is hygroscopic, is that the moisture level stays down. And obviously for my lungs, we don't want bacteria or mold. So I keep the dehumidifier running at all times from about early spring to late fall. In the winter, it dies off and it gets really dry here. And then I keep my plaster under very particular conditions in a plastic tub. And anything that would be subject to any issues is always kept in plastic and or tubs or something where in case there was a flood, it wouldn't be a problem. But no, I haven't ever really experienced any big issues. If I leave molds outside and they're wet, that would be really bad. So I often have to work hard to remember to put things in the car before I go to RIT or come back, and I always have to take them out because that's where I could have some, you know, if I'm transferring something there, I could have some breakage.
All right, thank you, Peter. I appreciate it. I think that was it as far as our time goes. We've already gone a little bit over, but thank you, everybody.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Peter. This was wonderful, and I think our just minds are spinning. So much to think about. We've learned so much, and we all, I can speak for all of us, I know, but in saying that we look forward to following you. And Leslie, we can't wait for the next exhibition of Peter's work at your gallery. And yes, I think you really should do a series, keep the series going. But thank you so much, both of you. And Brian, thank you. You contributed a great deal, and we have such a better understanding of Peter's work because of the talk that you started us off with. So we look forward to seeing you all at our next Founders Circle virtual event, which will be on March 23rd, when we will talk with the artist Eleanor Anand, who is a sculptor working in the medium of paper, not your traditional medium for a sculptor, but her work is very interesting. And then on April 27th, we will have an hour with Michael Sherrill, ceramicist, sculptor, and we hope you'll all join us for that. So thanks again, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.